session. It's a symposium called Ecosystem Services for Human Wellbeing Achievements and Future Research Directions. I'm Georgina Mace, and I'm going to be the chair. This session has actually been put together by Caroline Howe on behalf of the ESPA programme, which was is a NERC, DFID, ESRC funded programme. It started in 2010 and will come to an end in 2018. So this is a really nice time to look at some of the research that's emerging from ESPA. And the session's been funded by ESPA itself and by the Conservation Ecology SIG of the British Ecological Society, so thanks to them. We're going to run through the talks as in the programme. There have been a couple of changes. So the first one, which on your programme is Katrina Brown, has miraculously turned into Dan Brockington. So you may spot the difference, and I'm sure you will when you hear what he has to say. But otherwise, the programme is as given. And we'll try and keep a couple of minutes at the end of each talk for questions. But if we don't, we'll just move on through to try and keep on time. And then you should catch the speaker you want to talk to at the end of the session at 1 o'clock. So without further ado, let me introduce the first speaker, Dan Brockington, whose title is up there. I'm not sure if that's the right title or not. Yes, it is. Okay. Thank you, Dan.
Well, thank you, Georgina, and thank you particularly to Caroline for putting this session together. There you are, Caroline. Thank you very much indeed, and to all the speakers for turning up, and thank you also for coming. Yes, as Georgina said, at rather short notice, Katrina Brown had to pull out from giving the keynote, and I assure you that there was no one more disappointed than I was to learn that she wasn't going to be here. At least I hope I'm the most disappointed person in the room. The argument I want to present, and I'm going to stick to Katrina's title that she gave to me, which is to look at the future of ecosystem services and the relationship to the Sustainable Development Goals, but also I'm going to broaden it to more development, to larger development agendas. And it's simply that ecosystem services, I think, are generally marginalised within the policy mainstream. We can see that even with something like the Sustainable Development Goals. That it's not wise for ecosystem services to be marginalised thus, particularly if we think about some of the important governance arrangements of ecosystem services and how they are closely related to poverty alleviation agendas. And I'm also going to raise some questions about the possibility that should ecosystem services be mainstream, this might be something of a Pyrrhic victory. And it is not necessarily as welcome as we might suspect from the current position of finding ecosystem services rather marginalised. Now, it might at first sight seem strange to suggest that in something like the Sustainable Development Goals, ecosystem services or even environmental issues more broadly could be said to be marginalised. The clue is in the title, the Sustainable Development Goals. And if we compare them to the 8 Millennium Development Goals before them, environmental issues are surely more prominent, and concerns for ecosystems surely more prominent in these Sustainable Development Goals than they were before, with that last environmental sustainability goal tacked on at the end. But if you're, I think, specifically concerned about ecosystem services, there is, I would argue, less room for optimism. If we take the general idea of ecosystem services, I'm not going to get into the definitional issues, particularly with Georgina chairing this session, but if we are concerned that environmental services functions for their performance underpin all sorts of human activity in society and economy, and that without these functions and services, and numerous benefits and goods would be impossible. If we have this broader vision of what ecosystem services can do and are important for, you could argue that their separation into these, and isolation into these three goals at the end of climate action, of life below water, of life on land, is in itself problematic. Moreover, you could argue that the language used is again a rather weak use of the possibilities that ecosystem services discourse provides us. Only one of these goals mentions the word ecosystems. The 15th goal, which is concerned to halt and reverse degradation of terrestrial ecosystems and to halt biodiversity loss, mentions the word. Each goal has a number of targets, and that's how we know whether we're getting close to these goals in the future. And only in 7 of these 169 targets is there any mention of ecosystems, and only one of those invokes the possibility of ecosystem services. When we get down to the 230 indicators, which are used to measure how close we're getting to the targets which are important for the goals, then all use, and I met reference to ecosystem services, disappears. And this isn't just semantics. I find that the way in which ecosystem services are invoked and thought to be measured is either too general or too specific. So to illustrate, if we take target 2.4, concerned with sustainable food production, then we can see that notions which are equivalent to some important ecosystem services do appear. We have, for example, the idea of strengthening capacity to adapt to climate change, to cope with extreme weather and drought and flooding and other disasters, as well as improving soil quality. All of these invoke concepts of sustainable of ecosystem services, but look at the indicator against which will be used to measure that target. Surely that is a politician's dream, given how general and how imprecise the concept of sustainability can be. Conversely, if we consider one of the first target for Goal 15, which is all about conserving different forms of terrestrial and ecosystem and inland water systems. Here, the indicators intrigue me enormously. Forest is a proportion of total land area. This was present in the Millennium Development Goals, and I confess I've never understood why this was useful. What if your country isn't in a place where there's normally forest? In what sense is this a good indicator? And again, the 15.1.2, which is looking at the proportion of your ecosystem which is conserved by protected areas. With respect to ecosystem services, surely the whole point is that they underwrite and underpin economic activity in society all over the place, not just within protected areas. We don't have to get into the land sparing or land sharing debate here. We're not talking about what are the best strategies for halting biodiversity loss. The issue here is where do ecosystem services matter? Because I think they matter far beyond protected areas. But these indicators aren't being used to further that sort of thinking. And if we get beyond the Sustainable Development Goals, then I think it's much more obvious how marginal concern for ecosystem services actually is. I'm thinking here of the work of people like Paul Collier and Stefan Durkin. Paul Collier, you probably know, is the author of a book called The Bottom Billion, a former World Bank researcher, and now a populist writer and researcher in the University of Oxford about development issues. And Stefan Durkin is the chief economist at DFID. So these are significant development thinkers. Their views matter. And in these articles published in World Development and the Annual Review of Resource Economics, they argued that the thing that reduces poverty most is economic growth. And economic growth really requires a structural transformation. It requires a shift of labour and investment out of unproductive sectors, and that means unproductive rural sectors, smallholder farmers, forest-dependent communities, things like that, into much more productive sectors. So you take people from places where they're farming 2 acres or so with hand hoes and where the productivity added to labour is very small, and move them into sectors where they're repairing cars or building roads or designing software, where the value added is enormous, and the possibilities for economic growth and hence poverty alleviation are really quite considerable. And this means that investment in rural livelihoods, in support for forest dwellers' activity, for example, or the importance of ecosystem services as safety nets for the poor, as ways of coping with shocks in the ecosystem. All of this becomes much less important, in fact, almost something of a distraction. And if you're thinking about where wisely to invest development aid or government resources, then quite literally a distraction, because the most effort and the most attention should be concentrated on those sectors of the economy, so the argument goes, which will yield the most return on effort. Needless to say, the word ecosystem is entirely absent from papers like this. The environment is mentioned as a policy environment. And so, in this respect, the mention of environmental issues and concerns in the Sustainable Development Goals is actually thoroughly misleading, because ecosystem services are not even on the agenda of policy mainstream and thinkers like Paul Collier or Stefan Durkin. Or we can take UNEP's report, Towards a Green Economy, which came out in 2011. This modelled economic growth globally, using models which internalised some of the externalities which are normally not captured well in current measurements of economic growth and environmental change. It modelled the global economy then as if the environment actually mattered. And on the basis of that, proposed significant investment in green technology and on decarbonising the economy. It's just remarkable how little impact that report and that thinking has made. And how, in the mainstream, in parts of the world that I'm familiar with, in areas of East and Southern Africa, this sort of thinking just doesn't even get to the table. Or you can look at the work of the Forest and Livelihood Research Network run by Arun Agrawal out of Michigan, whose annual conference was last weekend, where we learned that something like 1% of World Bank funding goes to projects involving forests, where the single DFID and CEDA, the Swedish International Development Agency, with their representatives from those organisations, were continually bemoaning how marginal this thinking was within their own organisations, and trying to hoover up all the interesting data which suggested that these issues were important for poverty alleviation. Otherwise, you have hundreds of millions of forest dwellers whose livelihoods have not been imagined as being part of the development story. So for all these reasons, ecosystem services, despite a lot of the work that goes on, remain marginal to the mainstream. And yet, there is a huge amount of work which has been and is going on. With thanks to Sam Murphy, who put this graph together, this shows some of the work which is being published recently in the last 20 years or so about ecosystem services and poverty alleviation. And a little while after the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment came out, we've had a dramatic and remarkable increase, which is still going on, of scientific papers published yearly, reflecting in part the work of the ESPA programme itself, funded by DFID. And then there's also some fascinating work coming out as well with respect to the governance of ecosystem services and how important that can be for the livelihoods of poorer people. And I'd like to share some of the results coming out from Sheffield and the work of Johan Aldekop and his colleagues, including Arun, of Nepalese forest reserves. And Johan's point here is that Nepalese forest reserves have had this dramatic change in governance structures over the last 20 years, where over 18,000 community forests are now managed by the village development committees, and they're called village forest reserves or community forests. However, our knowledge of these is restricted to the 138 case studies, which, as a sample of over 18,000, really isn't very many at all. And if we want to understand what difference this sort of governance regime for forest reserves makes, then it behoves us to take a larger sample in order to understand how changing governance regime affects both the outcomes for forests and the outcomes for poverty alleviation. Now, the results which he gets are drawn from a number of existing data sources. This is Johan's other strength, which is that he takes existing data which are in the public domain, so measurements of forest cover from Hansen and others, from measurements of multidimensional poverty, also in the public domain, various aspects of slope and road distribution and rainfall, so that it is possible not only to look at the performance of village forest reserves, but to select other forests which are managed differently, not by villages, but yet come from similar regions, so that it is possible to do meaningful comparisons of matched pairs to see what difference there is in performance with respect to forest loss or gain, and also with poverty alleviation measures. This is not to say, of course, that these measures can be simply taken off the shelf and used easily. There's all sorts of problems with them. But given their limits, what can we learn from using them in a larger scale study? And rather briefly and rather crudely, Johan treated the forests which had no change in governance, which were not managed by villages, as the controls here. And then the forests which were managed by the villages, the village forest reserves, were the treatments. And what he observes, please, and don't look too closely at the y-axis on these instances, particularly when it comes to change in forest cover, but what he observes is that you have reducing poverty in places where there is governance by villages, and reducing rates of deforestation, again, where you have governance by villages, which is significantly different, not necessarily in absolute terms, but certainly statistically, of the effect, basically, of village governance over these forest reserves. Now, it is quite possible for this simply to be a geographical result, for the reduction in poverty to be happening in some places and the reduction in forest reserves to be happening in others, and you don't necessarily have the win-wins taking place. But if you plot these measurements against each other here, where you have the proportion of forest cover change on this axis and the proportion of poverty alleviation on the y-axis, what Johan found is that where you've got both a reduction in forest cover and slower rates of poverty alleviation, then this tends to be greater. These numbers tend to be greater where there is, in the absence of village forest reserves. Where you have the village forest reserves, where you have the treatment, then you are more likely to get these win-wins. You are more likely to get forests increasing and poverty alleviation poverty reducing faster. There are, therefore, I would argue, increasingly good data to suggest that ecosystem services matter a great deal for poverty alleviation, and particularly things like the governance of ecosystem services, which is what Johan's point is, matter a great deal, and matter at scale, which is the innovation that Johan is bringing here. And at the same time, we have to recognize how thin some of this database is. So Dan Miller and Reem Hajar have reviewed systematically the work which has looked at how forests are linked to prosperity. This isn't poverty alleviation, rather, this is prosperity more broadly. Now, all the green countries here have at least one study. And some of these will only have one study. A lot of the research is concentrated in places like Nepal, India, Mexico. There are significant countries with a huge amount of forest in them, for which there appear to be no studies linking forestry with prosperity. There are large regions of the world where researchers seem to be active, and some of the most prosperous parts of the world where forests and prosperity don't seem to have been studied at all. The evidence base, therefore, despite all the effort being put into it, is excessively thin. But finally, I'd also like to suggest that there are dangers in talking about ecosystem services and poverty alleviation, the dangers of tying ecosystem services to sustainable development goals, which I suspect an audience in this room is extremely familiar with. Again, if we go to Dan Miller and Reem Hajar's review and look at the sorts of things that were covered in the review, if you're being critical about this, you'd say it was rather dismal. That the concerns here were about economic living standards, material living standard, asset accumulation. These are the things that matter most. They matter a huge deal if you are concerned with poverty. But if you see poverty as multidimensional. It's not just about these things. And down the bottom here, where you have one or two studies, you have other aspects of the ways in which ecosystems matter and forests matter, which don't seem to be well covered by the researchers who have been exploring these topics. And then you have, beyond that, critiques like Bram Busher and Rob Fletcher, who are arguing that the very term ecosystem services places nature in a subservient role where it is only visible to the extent that it is rendered useful to our economies and societies. In my own experience of editing a journal special issue of environmental conservation, I found that many of the papers which came in were keen to value the ecosystem services and render them visible to economists. Now, we can see why they were doing that, but what intrigued me was how this agenda was taken as a given, that it was simply a good thing to do because everyone had to do that these days. There didn't seem to be particularly very much a questioning of that. Now, I wouldn't go as far as Bram and Rob myself. In my free time working for on the board of development NGOs in Mozambique, we are trying to commodify new forms of ecosystem service because they will reduce poverty faster in the places where we're working. I recognise the need to use this language when you're speaking to powerful groups who are otherwise ignoring you. At the same time, I think we also have to be wary that ecology matters far more to us than merely as an ecosystem service or as an environmental service, and this is a dangerous path that we're trying to get onto. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. So we do have time for a few questions, if anybody has anything they'd like to raise. If you would be patient and speak into a microphone because they're trying to record these sessions. So
thank you. I was very struck with the little quote at the end there, sort of linking ecosystem services to this neoliberal agenda, which a lot of people would argue they are linked. But of course, what's happened just recently, we seem now to be in a post-neoliberal world, and I wonder whether that's got implications, and maybe even an explanation partly for this failure to embed the concept in policy. If it's perceived as somehow linked to a failing political agenda, maybe that explains why some people aren't going for it.
Why do you think it's a post-neoliberal world?
Well, because you've had people like the World Bank even saying that we're now in a post-neoliberal world, and Trump's election is evidence of that.
I go with an author called Colin Crouch on this, a political politics analyst, who argues about that there is a strange non-death of neoliberalism, that it carries on and remains powerful even when it should have been killed off years ago. So in some respects it would be wonderful if we did prove to live in a post-neoliberal world and Bram and Rob's warnings proved to be outdated. That would be fantastic. I'm leery of this thing living on in other names, in other forms.
any other questions or comments? Yes, please, one down here.
Hi. Is it on? Yeah. The Old Cup paper, I think it might align kind of with work that Josh Sinner has done with coral reefs. So is that work published? And I was talking to Josh on Twitter and wondering if there could be some kind of nice synergy to look at if the forest analysis of looking at these kind of bright spots in terms of forest and the coral reef one could be brought together and see if there's complementary areas and trade-offs that might be going on.
I'm going to pass it on to Johan. The work isn't published yet. I do have his permission to present it here. Okay. There is, I'm sure, published work by Ashwini Shatri and others on the efficacy of different types of forest reserves, which could well link to that. Okay. Johan's work will be out very shortly, though.
Okay, thank you.
There's one here.
Right. At the end there, you were talking about a sort of need to keep the kind of commodification of ecosystem services in perspective. How do you haven't mentioned the term natural capital at all. I mean, I was recently hearing somebody speak from Natural England about the need to be flexible in moving in terminology between natural capital, ecosystem services, depending, as you hinted on, what you're wanting to achieve and who you're wanting to achieve it with. I mean, do you use that term, and do you think that the term natural capital has value or can be used in a way to achieve what we might want to achieve?
Look, don't restrict yourself to natural capital. In that's this sort of speaking to power effectively, then one has to be also be really good at being a chameleon in some respects.
Pascal?
Dan, I was just wondering, would you, thinking about the governance questions, distinguish between the governance of forests and the governance of forests for ecosystem services? Because in some ways, interest in the governance of forests through various forms can be traced back to earlier work, such as that by Ostrom and others. So is there something specific about the ecosystem services framing that's additional when you look at things like the Nepal Community Forestry Program?
It's a really good question, that, Pascal. Because in some respects, no, there's no difference. I mean, you're just talking about concentrations of trees which are heavier in particular spaces than others. And whether you call that forests or whether it's for a particular ecosystem services, it's still governance arrangements which depend upon different levels of decentralization and devolution, and you can have the discussion, as some literatures do, which focus entirely upon words like participation, devolution, decentralization, elite capture. And the ecology disappears. And yet, I think it's enormously important whether you are managing forest for water yields that come out of a catchment, or for carbon concentrations, or for biodiversity levels and different forms of biodiversity. If you're managing it for carbon, then you probably need to bury charcoal, and you need trees which grow quickly and sequester carbon rapidly. And this is an utterly different affair from managing it for biodiversity. So it does matter hugely what ecosystem service is being extracted, sought from the forest in question. Does that answer your question? Is there?
We can talk about it.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I think we probably should move on. Thank you very much, Dan, for the talk. So the next speaker is Esteve Corbera, who is going to talk about incorporating equity and recognition in biodiversity conservation.
You see, for once in my life, I followed the presenter's guidelines, and then they don't look nice. I apologize for that. This is formatted for 16:9, and 4:3 was the right way. Anyway, good morning, and thanks for being here. The title of my talk today is Incorporating Recognition in Biodiversity Conservation, which differs slightly from the program's title. I originally envisioned incorporating the argument and ideas of 2 recently published pieces, but when I attempted to do so, I realized it was far too much information. Therefore, my talk today draws only on the article you see on the screen, and therefore all authors deserve credit from what I'm going to say. From now on, you can choose to switch off, to read the slides, to follow my words and read the slides at the same time as you see fit. Our argument departs from the premise that making conservation socially just is ethically desirable, and it's conducive to the legitimacy and environmental effectiveness of conservation approaches in the long term. This premise is grounded on growing evidence that conservation that leads to fair outcomes or involves people in design and implementation results in more sound environmental outcomes. It is also grounded on a shared belief that conservation policy and practice has often placed much more emphasis on distributional and participation concerns than it has on recognition. Recognition and conservation are inextricably linked. By recognition, we generally mean the respect to plural social identities and cultural difference, and the extent to which different actors, ideas, and cultures are respected and valued in social encounters and public discourse. Bearing this in mind, the link between recognition and conservation appears evident for at least 3 reasons. First, protected areas in their variegated forms are especially associated with cultural diversity and with people whose knowledge and environmental governance institutions are vulnerable to being marginalized. Second, mainstream conservation management strategies are influenced by culturally specific and often disputed ideas about what works and about what counts as evidence of what works. Third, dominant blueprints about how conservation should be done become a basis for the misrepresentation and misrecognition of indigenous and local peoples. For example, the Yosemite model of conservation, in which nature is conceived as wilderness, has led to the representation of local and indigenous lifestyles as harmful to nature conservation. We sustain, however, that biodiversity conservation can work constructively with local communities, especially if it embraces the concept of recognition. Where innovative, non-exclusionary models are developed, indigenous and local people can support protected areas as a way to positively promote both their territories and traditions. Fortunately, there is of course evidence in this regard. The language of equity and rights has been present in global conservation discourse since at least the 1970s and 80s. Ideas of inter and intragenerational equity were foundational to popular narratives of sustainable development. Article 1 of the Convention on Biological Diversity highlights as one of its 3 main objectives, quote, the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources. The Nagoya Protocol in 2010 has aimed to develop further this objective, and it has also emphasized, quote, the important role of traditional knowledge. However, we argue, these efforts have led to controversies over recognition. One charge is that the CBD and the protocol are culturally dominating, requiring prospective beneficiaries to assimilate imposed ideas of what is fair and equitable as a condition of benefiting. Additionally, it has also been argued that despite the CBD has acknowledged cultural diversity and the identity of indigenous peoples as both conducive to and key relevant issues to protecting the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, the Convention has also endorsed approaches that conflict with traditional ethics of a stewardship of nature, notably with regard to what we were discussing right now, the so-called valuation or marketization of nature. We are not naive, however. The application of recognition in conservation remains difficult, not least because of contested meanings and approaches. And for this reason, the remaining of this talk focuses on how 4 schools of thoughts on recognition have understood the concept. And in doing so, I hope to reveal common concerns that can serve as a basis for progress in conservation policy and practice. To distinguish analytically these schools of thought, we employ a simple conceptual framework that decomposes them into 4 dimensions: subjects, harms, mechanisms, and responses. Subjects refer to the actors or users who are entitled to moral consideration. In other words, those who hold rights and deserve recognition. Harms are the kinds of injustice suffered by these moral subjects that can vary according to the dimension of environmental justice that you are interested in. Distributive injustice is more likely to result in objective material harms, such as impoverishment, whilst misrecognition tends to be linked with harms to subjective well-being, such as reduced self-esteem. Mechanisms refer to the institutional and structural explanations for such harms. This involves asking the question, how can we explain how similar injustices appear repeatedly in different places and times? In this regard, recognition theories argue that misrecognition arises from the realms of ideas and culture, or from economic structures of society, or from a combination of both. Finally, it is inevitable that schools of thought that identify different harms and mechanisms will also propose different solution frameworks. For some, responses can start with individual efforts at self-development, such as recognizing one's connectedness to the rest of nature. For others, a more political project might be required, such as expanding participatory democracy or redefining national constitutions to allow for plural notions of citizenship, among others. Let me turn now to provide a bit more detail on each of these 4 schools of thought and to lay out the implications of taking them into account for conservation. George Hegel is considered the founder of the continental European ethics of recognition. He conceived the struggle against injustice in terms of an essential need to be recognized and respected by others. Recognition is essential because it's the basis of individual freedom. In turn, human freedom cannot be achieved unilaterally, but only through social interactions, and social interactions of a psychological nature. In these social interactions, a person can only really value their own life if they see that others value such a life. It is not possible to have high self-esteem if you perceive that others treat you with contempt. For Hegel, the mechanism of subjugation was thus psychological, and the required response was to move relations towards more reciprocal recognition. The implications of adopting this reasoning in conservation are twofold. First, it is clearly a call for understanding individual sentiments in conservation context. It's a need to make sure that their feelings or values are listened to and embraced. Second, it is a call for conservationists to be aware of the historical legacy and imprint of certain conservation approaches on local and indigenous peoples' histories and cultures. A critical theory approach to recognition does not differ from a Hegelian account of recognition in terms of the subjects of justice, but differs in terms of the nature of harms, the mechanisms by which these are produced, and the suggested solution frameworks. Nancy Fraser, one of the most important and contemporary critical theorists, argues that societies develop hierarchies of cultural values that degrade the status of some groups of people, thereby culturally subordinating them and denying equality of social interaction. Injustices also arise out of a combination of economic exploitation and cultural subordination, neither of which can be analytically subsumed under the other. Gender inequality, for example, has connected roots in both culture and economic arrangements, such as local rules of resource access. As with Hegelian thinking, responses need to be affirmative efforts to tackle cultural misrecognition. However, to achieve parity of participation, there is also a need to transform the institutions that define distribution and political representation. Such combined focus on recognition and distribution appears fruitful for people like us. First, economic inequalities are often considered to be drivers of biodiversity loss, both through mechanisms of impoverishment of some groups that undermine their sustainable practices, and through the corresponding enrichment of others who fuel profligate consumption. Second, however, this is only part of the story, because conservationists need to be aware that their material practices are entwined with the status inequalities and political marginalization that should be acknowledged and reworked if necessary. Decolonial thinking, the third school of thought that we are reviewing here, has roots in both Hegelianism and critical theory, emphasizing forms of social, cultural, and political subordination that deny freedom and opportunity to some groups. This dominating European culture, however, it is distinct from the previous two because it truly focuses on the global south and for identifying mechanisms of subordination in Eurocentric scientific and political worldviews. This dominating European culture is institutionalized through education, the media, state-sanctioned languages, and behavioral norms. This school of thought is inspired by indigenous peoples' movements and their struggles against modernity, and it therefore has links with indigenous cosmogonies, leading to conceptions of justice that emphasize community over individuals and includes moral responsibilities towards Mother Nature or intangible beings such as spirits. The most important implication of such thinking for what brings us here today is acknowledging that conservation practice and its associated knowledge forms are part of a dominant form of knowledge production, Western science, institutionalized within bodies such as the CBD, which has at times marginalized local forms of knowledge. Therefore, responding to conservation injustice must include democratizing science itself by creating opportunities for intercultural dialogues as part of the knowledge production process. Finally, the Capabilities School does not by itself develop a theory of recognition, but offers a comprehensive view of the conditions needed for a good life that incorporates aspects of recognition, participation, and distribution. Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, two of its most prominent representatives, argue that what is relevant for justice is whether individual persons have the freedom to realize the objectives they have in life. In other words, the good to which justice aspires is defined in terms of a person's opportunity or capabilities rather than their actual achievements. Generally speaking, a person who has fewer capabilities or opportunities to accomplish what they reasonably value would be regarded as less well off than others. In that sense, injustice then is the denial of choice, and particularly the denial of some things that are universally essential for a dignified life, such as bodily health or control over one's environment, but also control over key resources for sustaining or pursuing the desired living, such as food and water. Overall, critical theorists agree that injustice arises from forms of governance and political organization that lead to a reduction in the available options that one has to pursue her own needs and interests. Such thinking, my friends, is an everyday confrontation for us because maintaining biodiversity and ecological processes is entwined with and can often conflict with valued ways of life. Such awareness should in turn lead towards a very careful understanding and negotiation of individual communities' needs and aspirations in order to avoid precluding their access to basic needs and hampering their capabilities. To conclude, where do all these reflections take us? I hope that some of you are still with me. Why did I think it was important to bring them forward in a setting like this? On the one hand, to share with you a very, very small portion of the breadth of knowledge that political philosophers can offer to conservation scholars and practitioners. This knowledge can help us thinking more critically about our own research and implementation agendas and how we contribute to reduce or enhance recognition injustices. On the other hand, these schools of thought indirectly put the responsibility of realizing a more just conservation on our shoulders, since we undoubtedly belong to those who hold a position of power in social encounters of conservation and who don't bear the costs of such. Finally, the schools of thought, taken together, offer at least 4 practical ways of incorporating recognition in biodiversity conservation. First, we need to move beyond a distributive model of thinking about the social benefits and cost of conservation. This model is of course important, but the theories of recognition presented also reveal the limitations of a distributive model, and in doing so invite us to identify social categories of concern that require additional coverage in conservation research and practice, including non-right holders, transgendered identities, women, of course, caste, migrants, and so on. Second, recognition theories allow us to reflect on the fact that the social impacts of conservation are in large part relational, whether this is taken in a Hegelian sense, that inequitable relationships constitute the harm itself, or more in line with feminist, critical, and decolonial scholars, that this is part of a broader structuring of social relations that produces low status for some groups. Third, as we develop practices that attend to these relational concerns, we can be guided by the concerns over the status of peasant cultures and knowledge worldwide. Whilst the CBD is committed to recognizing different knowledge, it is clear that ways of working across alternative ways of perceiving and valuing nature are still not widely effective in many parts and sides of the world. Look at the type of research we do, focused on economic thinking. Improving recognition should thus be about acknowledging that conservation can produce harms as well as provide opportunities. We should also change power relations and move towards relationships of more equal influence. This brings us to the 4th and final action, namely to become aware that equitable influence over decision-making will rarely be served by use of predefined blueprints for biodiversity conservation, whether it be models for protected areas or market-based instruments. Such blueprints, such as the ecosystem services model that we might be discussing here today, are themselves institutionalizations of particular Western ways of knowing and valuing nature, which can act as barriers that prevent consideration of alternative knowledge and values. My friends, I realize that acknowledging this might represent real challenges for field conservation in terms of resource constraints, methods, and training, and in some cases, political constraints. But if we are serious about the commitment for conservation to be socially just, then engaging with issues of recognition is a necessary step to take. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we're out of time, I'm sorry. So we'll have to do questions at the end. If anyone has questions for Esteve, please find him at the end of the session. So the next talk is by Caroline Howe on building bridges, and I'll let her introduce the title.
Okay. Assuming it. Do I just prep them? Oh yeah, it does. Okay. I'll wait till a few people are getting settled. But. So today I'm going to be talking about one of the sort of most recent ESPA-funded projects, which is actually in collaboration with a lot of people who have been speaking this session today. And it's I'm based at the University of Sheffield, and it's also in collaboration with the University of Cambridge and also at the University of Barcelona as well. And so a lot of current ways of thinking, sort of frameworks for ecosystem services, the Sustainable Development Goals, as we've heard a lot about already today, are built around the principle that you can actually achieve win-wins. That if you do some form of sustainable management of ecosystem services, you can actually deliver human well-being outcomes as well. But actually, there's quite a lot of evidence that that's not necessarily the case. So in 2014, we carried out a study on over 1,400 papers which actually showed that trade-offs were recorded 3 times more often than synergies. And there were actually some quite clear indicators as to why those trade-offs actually occurred. And this is not the only kind of work that's been done. It's actually been referred to as the fatal attraction of win-win solutions by Moradian et al. In another paper that came out at a similar time to that as well. A lot of time because people are sort of using the payments for ecosystem services process as a sort of potential for achieving these win-wins. Now, what we actually thought about these things is not necessarily that they don't exist, but actually perhaps there's something else going on, and actually the evidence for these trade-offs, for these win-wins is just not being recorded. So the process of this project was actually sort of threefold. So firstly, we sort of looked at the literature to see where we felt people, sort of principles that people were holding. We call them these normative positions, where people were sort of on a sort of continuum between different scales, and that's how they might be thinking differently actually about ecosystem services for poverty alleviation. And then we wanted to test that, so we carried out a quantitative questionnaire asking people what they thought about these normative positions, and also about how they actually defined ecosystem services and defined poverty alleviation, to see whether they were different as well. And then finally we carried out a social network analysis of the sort of co-authoring patterns in this field to see if they actually all matched up. So what we started with was we looked at 3 different frameworks for ecosystem services that are quite common. So it's the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, IPBES, and the UK NEA. And what it was quite clear here that actually even within these frameworks which seem to be addressing the same problem, there's differences over the conceptualization of ecosystem services and all their benefits and also the functionality. There's also differences over meanings of poverty. And consequently, there's sort of differences over, therefore, the kind of institutions that would be appropriate, the scale at which you're acting, how do you sort of govern benefit distribution, etc. And then these lead to these different normative positions where you're sort of on a scale between your primary motivation being nature and the environment all the way to your primary motivation actually being more about economic growth. So here are the 5 positions that we came up with. So in position 1, this is very much a sort of, this is conservationist approach. It's not that the fact that people who take this approach think that poverty alleviation isn't important, but actually that the 2 things should actually be separate and they should be considered separately. If you go into position 2, there's more of an understanding here that actually people do affect the ecological integrity of ecosystems, and therefore you have to manage ecosystems in such a way that you maintain that functional integrity, and that will have to involve some consideration of people's needs as well. In position 3, this is a sort of the mainstream. You know that people actually do rely intimately on the environment for ecosystem services and also for their livelihoods as well. And so you cannot manage those ecosystem services without considering those existing lives and livelihoods of the poor. But it is a sort of maintaining the status quo in this particular position. Now, in position 4, that's moving forward. That's actually developing sort of new benefits that could come out of maybe changing how you use ecosystem services. So things like RED Plus would come into this position. And then finally, if you move to position 5, this is sort of the opposite extreme to position 1, which is where it's all about economic growth. And again, the idea that actually you have to completely remove people from the environment if you're actually going to achieve poverty alleviation. You have to separate the two out. So you can see here that we sort of shown that the priority given to nature obviously changes from high down to low when you get to position 5, and obviously vice versa if you're talking about your interest in poverty alleviation. And also the scale at which development is planned is also different in these. So the first 4 cases is very much more of a local focus, whereas position 5 is much more of a national sort of global scale. So we produced these normative positions, and then we wanted to ask people whether or not they agreed with them, whether they felt they were appropriate, whether they encapsulated what sort of general thinking in this field. So this is the questionnaire structure that we had. So we obviously asked people about their demographics, the background, just to try and get some sort of ideas of whether they were actually even genuinely interested in clarifying these relationships between ecosystem services and poverty alleviation. Did they think it was important or not? And then we wanted to know about their ideas surrounding ecosystem services and poverty alleviation. Did they think that win-wins were possible? The definitions they were using, this was quite interesting. A lot of people did have very different definitions for both ecosystem services and poverty alleviation. And then we also wanted to know about whether they thought different types of ecosystem services were important or not. Were they more interested in provisioning services, or was it sort of more cultural services that they were interested in? And then, of course, we brought in these normative positions, and then obviously how you govern ecosystem services or poverty alleviation, or one for the other. And finally, we actually just threw in a question about issues of language, which actually threw up some really nice responses, which was actually that obviously if you translate ecosystem services into another language and then translate it back into English, you get very different findings, and it always gets lost in translation. So we haven't actually analysed that yet, whether that's made a difference or not, but it was an interesting question at least to ask to see, because a lot of people are obviously not working where English is the primary language. So unfortunately, the questionnaire is actually still live. We'd hoped it would be closed by now. We could have started some more quantitative analysis. It's actually open till the end of this year. So what I'm showing here is some preliminary results from this and from the social network analysis. So far we have 157 respondents to the questionnaire. Now, obviously, fortunately, there is a bias towards higher education and university people working in universities, and that's probably because of the networks that we were using to target this questionnaire, which is a bit unfortunate. We would have liked more practitioners, if possible, to sort of get that broader view. But what we did find is actually there was a very broad global spread of research areas across the natural sciences as well as across the social sciences as well. So hopefully we did reflect a lot of different viewpoints on that. And this was actually... This was actually also shown in the social network analysis as well. So the categories are slightly different again, but you can see that only just over half is sort of the biological sciences, and the other half is more of the social sciences as well. So again, that it's quite good that the two actually sort of reflect each other. This is taken again from the social network analysis, and it shows where authors that we found their current employment country. And again, obviously you can see a huge dominance by the USA and by the UK. But obviously there is still a good broad spread across the globe of people working in other countries. So people are authoring these papers that aren't just hopefully dominated by that Western perspective perhaps, and hopefully we will get some interesting results from that. So what we did ask, as I said, we were interested about these trade-offs. And sort of 92% of people said that they did think that trade-offs occur at the interface of ecosystem service management and poverty alleviation. It was quite an overwhelming response to that. But quite nicely, almost the same number of people, 90% of them, did think it was actually possible to get win-wins. So somehow they weren't happening, but they did think it was possible that somehow we could maybe change management or something, and that actually we could get win-wins in the end. What we also asked people about was about different kinds of management options for different ecosystem services. So here I've just taken carbon storage as one example, and we asked them about 3 different types of ways that you could govern that particular ecosystem service. So, and then on this side of the scale, with 1, it's the level of agreement you actually disagree that that is an appropriate option, and then 6 is where you sort of 100% agree with that. So what's quite interesting actually is that markets aren't as strongly represented as, say, people thinking that actually it should be to do with civil society, which is quite unusual for sort of carbon storage, as you think it might be around these new markets and sort of RED+, etc. But actually people don't feel that's necessarily quite as successful as a government option, and they're more interested in the regulations and civil society. Gonna go? And then finally, we asked about the normative positions, and again, the level of agreement with whether they felt these statements were appropriate or not. And again, the 1 is they disagree, and 6 is they agree. So you can actually see that the first 4 positions are quite positive. People responded quite well to those. They tended to agree that they were positions that you could hold about ecosystem services for poverty alleviation, and particularly when you're moving towards a sort of 3 and 4 positions where there's sort of the integration of livelihoods, or bringing new benefits to the poor. But as you can see, a lot more people did disagree with that 5th position, which was that it should be about economic growth. Now that could be, again, the sort of people that we targeted in our networks that we asked the questionnaire about, but it could also just sort of be, hopefully, another option. So what we haven't done yet, though, is sort of link these then to how people have defined ecosystem services and poverty alleviation, and that's the sort of the next stage of this project. So I'd just like to thank you for listening, and the questionnaire is still live. I know some of you already actually have answered this questionnaire, but if you haven't, we'd be really grateful if you would mind putting your thoughts together on this, and also thank you to all my collaborators on this project as well.
Thank you very much, Caroline. So anybody got a question? Yeah, there's one over here. Just wait for the microphone to come.
Thank you. Thank you. It looks really fascinating research. I'm curious, this links a little bit with the previous talk as well, I suppose, to know what initiatives do you see happening to help bridge these different knowledge communities, especially between, say, global north and global south?
That's a really interesting question. We actually hadn't thought about it. So we hadn't actually asked that ever in the questionnaire, as well as what people had sort of solutions to this. It was more actually just to sort of, I suppose, highlight that there were these huge gaps between the different people thinking they worked in the same field, but actually being quite disparate in their thought processes. And hopefully, I suppose we hope that maybe it will sort of, because people become more aware of that actually they do need to sort of try and learn to discuss with other people that, that they can bridge these gaps. But it's true that we haven't actually approached that as a question, but it's interesting as a thought process.
One here, please.
Thank you, that's really interesting. Actually, follow on from that, do you think there's a connection in these kind of different epistemologies that maybe in some ways connects to some other things that were brought up in the other talk around indicators and what we have in our minds, as well as indicators of ecosystem services? Because I think that's quite fuzzy, and we're not clear about that, and maybe there's a connection in that. Is that something that you can see or that you've thought about?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely true, because actually some of the questions in the questionnaire was about, we had, how do you define ecosystem services and or poverty alleviation? And although these people, again, seem to think they're all working from the same framework, their definitions are completely different, which I think, and then unfortunately leads to, you almost have to have fuzzy indicators, because no one's really sure about what it is that you're actually measuring. And it was just interesting just to analyse those different frameworks and show that even those which were supposed to be the same almost were different as well. And obviously people then choose which framework they prefer. It's often the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, but perhaps it's now going to move towards IPBES. And that may continue, unfortunately, that sort of disparity in people's definitions that they're using.
Time for one more quick one. Yes, please.
Hi, sorry if you've already said this. I was just wondering, for your questionnaire, you said that it was quite biased towards people that were in higher education and you didn't get enough as many practitioners as you wanted. I was wondering if you'd been able to do any analysis on whether the answers from these two sorts of people differ.
Well, not yet, unfortunately, because we haven't closed the questionnaire, but the intention is to do that, because hence why we asked the question, because I imagine that will be probably significant in terms of their approaches to this issue. Like I said, it would have been nice if we had 50-50, but unfortunately that wasn't the case, but yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Caroline. So the next speaker is Simon Wilcock, who's going to talk about minimum adequate models for mapping ecosystem services. Simon.
So I guess I should start by saying that I'm just speaking about most of these results. Lots and lots of people were involved, one of whom is in the room. So if you think of a really hard question and ask it to me, I'm going to just default to Danny and let him answer it. The other warning I should probably give is that I'm a massive cynic. So I'm going to question some things that everyone in the room hopefully believes, but whether they're true or not is potentially different. So we'll start with including ecosystem services in decision making is crucial. Is it? There is some evidence for this, but really, we were kind of unsure in our project, and so I'm speaking for the WISER project, which is ESPA funded. So we asked some decision makers in sub-Saharan Africa, and we had a massively biased sample, because obviously the ones that were prepared to talk to us and answer our questions were the ones that were actually interested in ecosystem services. But they do exist. We had at least 60 people, and like 58 of them were like, yes, we are interested in ecosystem services, but they had a problem. They did not have enough data. So us being, helpful, optimistic people, we were like, well, if you haven't got data, you can use a model. That's all right, yeah? That might work. But what kind of things do you need in a model? And they were like, oh, we need it to be able to run scenarios, and the models have to be a certain level of accuracy. No real surprises there. But can ecosystem service models actually fill this gap? Are they good enough? Are we modeling the right things? We don't actually really know, especially not in sub-Saharan Africa. There are a lot of models out there that claim to work globally and have never been tested in this region, for example, mainly due to a massive data deficiency. There are also tons of models. I work with loads of models, and even I don't use them all. So there's some very, very simple models, and that can just be like a lookup table. Literally, if there is forest here, therefore there's firewood. Why not? That works, benefits transfer. And it can work, or does it work? Or there are more complex models, something like LPJ Guess, for example, which is models that have slowly become more complex over decades. Are they better? Was all that scientific effort worth it? Or actually, could we have gone with the simplest one and just given up? So we questioned these. We questioned these assumptions. We ran various models at various scales. So we ran them at 1 kilometer and 10 kilometer resolutions to see if, scientists like to get as accurate as possible. 300 meters is often bandied around. But do we need that extra accuracy? We looked at decisions on different scales, a national scale, regional scales, and then sort of at a point level as well, local scales. And we looked at a variety of different models with varying complexity. And then we focused on basically the ecosystem services for which we could find some data. Once we had all these models run and all these services and all the data, we realized that actually sometimes you're comparing apples with oranges. The models quite often are natural science models. They don't tend to have a social science component. So you're running a model saying, okay, we know there's biomass here, therefore there's firewood. Is that a valid assumption? So we tested that. We tested whether the models, which kind of can be captured with the term potential ecosystem services, actually match the ecosystem services that are being used. We then also said, like conversely, actually, is that if the biomass is not a good predictor, maybe people are. Where the people are present, perhaps that's a very, very good indicator of ecosystem services. And then the third comparison would be actually, maybe it's both. Maybe you need forests and people to make firewood. It kind of sounds, quite simple, but there are very few models that actually do this. And I'm going to run you through a grazing example, mainly to demonstrate some of the results. So you can see here for grazing, we ran a variety of models. There's lots of different complexity, different resolutions, and then we validated it against 3 data sets at 2 different spatial scales. And here are the results. So if the models are really, really good, they should follow that one-to-one line in the middle. You can see, like the correlation statistics at the top, the rows generally are not very good. Grazing is very hard to model, and most of these models up here are potential ecosystem service only. So they're effectively your natural science sort of models. Then we have our shocking result. Population density on its own is a much better predictor of grazing, of the ecosystem service of grazing, than any of the natural science models in isolation. So as a natural science modeler, I was gutted. But fortunately, we had a get out of jail card. Because when you do combine the 2 models, when you combine your natural science models with a simple population density layer and think, okay, where is there grazing and where are there people? Where is there grassland and where are there people? That is much more likely to be grazed than an area where there's grassland and not people. And the rows do significantly increase. You can see like the Skulls model there. When combined with a population layer, it becomes a much better fit to the data. And then, so we did this not just for grazing, we did this for all the ecosystem services listed there. And some good news. For most of the services, so you can see on the maximum, the last column over there, for most of the services, there is at least one model that does a pretty good job. So collectively, we can give ourselves a bit of a pat on the back. If you look at the means, though, you can see that actually there's quite a lot of models that do quite a bad job. How do you tell the difference? There's also a bit of a nuance here that the biophysical models, the natural science models, actually work quite well for certain services. They work quite well for carbon and quite well for water. But the charcoal, firewood, and grazing, if you're neglecting a social science aspect of your model, then potentially you're going to have a very, very inaccurate result. So how can we tell the good models from the bad models? Because there are hundreds. You saw on my graph, there were loads and loads of lines. So here's some complex graphs, but basically this shows all the results in one slide. For a minute, I want you to focus on the bottom down here. So that is the results at 1K. And basically, the higher they are up on that graph, the better the model. So when you flick your eyes between the 1K graph, the regional level results to the local level results, generally you can see that all the dots on that graph are higher. So this result basically means that the models that we used are not very good at predicting ecosystem service use at a local scale, but they are quite good at a regional and a national scale. So your national government could probably use ecosystem service models to support his decision making, but someone within a village at a point probably shouldn't. He'd be better off collecting data. So you can also see in the column of the data closest to me on all 3 graphs, that is the result for population data only. And you can generally see actually that the spread of the population data only is pretty comparable with the spread of the more complex sort of natural science models. And this sort of shows the result I showed you before with grazing, that population density can be a very good predictor of ecosystem service use. Something that you can't really detect here, well, you can't see it visually, but it is there statistically, I promise you. As we go from left to right on these graphs, your models get more complex. And the more complex models are actually better. They are more accurate. So that added scientific effort seems to be having an impact. The last column on all of these graphs, it's labeled Combi Models. That's effectively models ensembles. And you can see that the model ensembles here, they don't tend to make the models, they don't tend to give you a more accurate answer. What they do, a model ensemble, and it makes perfect sense. Basically, you take lots of models, you average them. It basically averages out the noise. So you lose the very good models and you lose the very bad models. You just kind of get mediocrity. So that's sort of, I can then sum up. So yes, in most cases, at least one model is accurate. And if you were talking to a decision maker, I'd be like, go for a more complex model. They tend to be better. In particular, models with more data inputs show the greatest increase. So if you've got a model with one data input and a model with 20, go for the one with 20. You don't even have to know much about the model. The downside there is the reason they've got this problem is because there's no data to start with. So potentially they can't run the better model. Adding beneficiaries does improve the models. So if you're a natural scientist like me, a natural science modeler, start thinking about people and put them in. However, there is an issue here of significance against importance. So we have shown that more complex and beneficiaries it significantly increases it. But we're still looking into the amount of variation that is explained by the added complexity. It will be the law of diminishing returns. You've captured 80%, and then you have to really, really struggle to get the last 20. Is that struggle worth it? And that's a question that we're currently looking into. And whilst I have said that model ensembles are not particularly useful, one use of a model ensemble, rather than just averaging out noise, could be able to give you an indication of uncertainty. So you could say, oh, in this area, there's actually great variation between all the models. So potentially in this area, we don't really know what's going on. So rather than say, oh, we've got an answer here, we can say, actually, this is an area that really needs to be studied. So that's something that we're going to look at next, is like the standard deviation of the ensemble models, actually more informative than the mean, per se. And can that standard deviation be used to predict actual uncertainty? So that would enable you to run the best model, then compare it with the standard deviation of the model ensemble, and you will then have the best answer possible, but also a sort of metric of uncertainty. And because we've done models over the whole sub-Saharan Africa, I've got lots and lots of people to thank, including the people that paid for this talk. So there we go.
Thank you, Simon. So we have time for some questions, if there are any. Yeah, one down here.
Thanks, Simon. My question is, what are you testing against? What's your measure of truth? And in what way is that independent from what's feeding into these models?
So, I mean, that varies from model to model, but a lot of the data sets we're comparing to, so carbon is a good example. The local level data was plot data, just literally all the trees that Simon Lewis and Oliver Phillip have measured, part of Afrotron and Rainfall and that sort of stuff. And also at a local level, then at a regional level, you've got some countries report at a regional level how much carbon they think they store. And then at a national level, you obviously got all the FAO reporting and that kind of stuff. It's not very accurate, but it's the best we've got. We had to take that as truth. There's loads of uncertainty in there as well, but we don't really have the ability to assess that. The models have usually completely different inputs sometimes. So LPG gas, for example, is driven by climate data. So it is an independent comparison, and it is valid, if that helps.
I guess I see models as tools for supporting decision making, and so I wonder what decisions you think the models that you're testing will be supporting.
Well, I think the finding that the models generally are pretty good at national and regional levels If you're thinking of an international NGO and they're like, oh, which country should I really invest my money in to support increase carbon, for example, the models could really help that decision. And the same with a national government making the same decision about regions. Where should I site this protected area to increase water supply, for example, is a question that we think the models could answer. Some of the local level, sort of community level stuff, we just can't support that sort of decision.
Any other questions? Yes, one here. We've just got time for one last one.
Have you looked at actually comparing this against the cost of acquisition? So I did something like this with looking at different elevation models, looking at like cost of acquisition for LiDAR versus more coarse. Have you considered looking at that, or have you at all? Yeah.
So I'm really cheap, those that know me, and all those models are free. We did look at, rather than cost of acquisition in monetary terms, sort of effort to run. So lots of models, some of them have lots of data inputs that the user has to find, put in. Others,
so you can put value to that.
Yeah, others have, like, it's all automated, and it just goes. And it doesn't matter whether the inputs are automated or not, they give the same accuracy of answer, but obviously it's easier to use one that is automated.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. So the next speaker is Julia Jones, talking about Madagascan payments for ecosystem services.
Thanks, Georgina. Okay, thank you very much. And this talk is also the result of an ESPA-funded project, and I'm actually going to be drawing on results from all over the project, and the lead authors of the various papers I'll be referring to are shown there. So it's very much a kind of synthesis of a huge amount of work by about 40 people. This is my daughter Anwen and a friend of hers, Natalie. Natalie's from the eastern rainforests of Madagascar. And I've known Natalie's mum since before we both had kids. That's them together as babies. And as parents, we both want exactly the same thing for our children. We want them to grow up healthy and happy and able to fulfill their full potential as human beings. Now, who knows what the future holds? They're both 10 at the moment, but the reality is that the poverty of Natalie's family, village and country constrains her opportunities. And that's what we mean by poverty. Poverty is not about money in the pocket, it's about your opportunities to fulfill your potential. And when I use the word well-being, I'm very simply defining it as the absence of poverty. EJ will talk a lot more about well-being later on. We're all aware that there are global benefits from some ecosystem services. We all know that carbon has value. Carbon being sequestered and stored has a value. Biodiversity has global values. Global payment schemes are schemes such as REDD+ or biodiversity conservation payments that aim to incentivize the maintenance of these global services. But the reality is they can have local costs. So what I'm going to talk about today is using a specific case study to look at what the net local poverty impacts might be of a global payment scheme. And the scheme I'm looking at is a REDD+ project, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, and it's in the corridor in Kenihen-Zahmena in eastern Madagascar. And this is a really hard place to get around. It's really quite remote. Even where you can get a vehicle to, it involves all sorts of shenanigans, such as floating it around on rafts. But most of the communities that are affected by this project and that we've been collecting data in are often a day or two's walk from where you get your vehicle to. And they are extremely poor. By all measures, they are pretty much as poor as people get. Now, conservation has costs. We can't deny this. There's an often told conservation narrative that people dependent on slash and burn agriculture, or swidden agriculture on the forest frontier, are doing something that's economically irrational because it erodes the soils and very quickly fertility is lost and people don't benefit so long term. So if you stop people doing it, there's no real cost because they weren't going to benefit long term anyway. That's not true. This is a village I was at recently, the northern area of Kaz. They're about 2 days' walk from the nearest market of any real sort, where you can get a vehicle to, certainly. People there are doing fine. They're growing perennial crops on land that was cleared from forest about 60 years ago. there's a very real opportunity cost of restricting people's ability to clear land. People in this area know full well it's illegal to clear forest land. People go to jail for it, and if you know anything about Malagasy jails, it's not a place you want to be. So people take a real risk in clearing land. So there must be something in it for them. But of course, there are benefits to local people from forest conservation. We hear a lot about ecosystem services, and one of the ones we hear most about is water. So the idea that there can be either water quality or quantity or timing of availability of water benefits that come from conserving forest relative to clearing it. Now, of course, in these global payment schemes, there's a net cash transfer from the global beneficiaries of the ecosystem service, such as carbon or biodiversity, to recipient countries that ultimately it should, at least in theory, be filtering down in some sort of benefit-sharing scheme spent on micro-development projects at the local level. And those, of course, can have a positive impact on poverty at the local scale. These are the costs and the benefits that I'm going to be talking about in my talk. Of course, there's other ones that can come from forest conservation. There's other benefits, including cultural benefits, wild harvested products. I'm not going to talk about those. Okay, so the first thing that we did in our project was we needed some kind of a realistic scenario over the next decade, what we expect to happen to forest conservation. So using remote sense data, we're able to predict or sort of model and project forward business as usual deforestation. And then through our understanding and our work with partners to really understand the policy process in Madagascar at the moment, we've developed a number of different scenarios, one of which we call effective conservation. And about 35,000 hectares of forest in the CAS corridor would expect to be conserved under effective conservation relative to what we'd expect to be lost under business as usual. So first of all, let's have a look at the costs of that conservation in terms of the restriction on opportunity to expand agricultural land. And we've got two really fantastic data sets on this. So the first is a choice experiment that was designed by Sarabidi Rakut-Nariv as part of her PhD, and she's got sort of 4 papers that underpin the validity of this choice experiment. We then have applied it quite wide, a number of sites around the corridor to estimate a local opportunity cost. With the subset of those households, we've done really intensive year-long studies trying to understand their household economy, their inputs, outputs. We've mapped agricultural land, very intensive study. And what have we found? Well, opportunity costs, as measured with this choice experiment, are very significant in terms of incomes. So our annualized costs, approximately 40 to 140% of mean annual income. So imagine, I mean, that's really important. Imagine if you were to lose 50% of your annual income. That matters, that's significant. And the key point is there's a negative slope here. So as a proportion of household income, the costs are greater for the poorer households. And who bears these costs? Well, the costs are highest for those closest to the forest and those that have a lower level of education. This makes sense because those people have fewer alternative options for making a living other than swidden agriculture at the forest frontier. And our estimate is, that should say 63,000. There's about 63,000 people living around CAS to whom these costs apply. Okay, so let's look at the benefits. That's the costs, we've estimated those. Benefits. We were lucky in this project to work with hydrologists. I've never worked with hydrologists before, I just love them. They're the most can-do bunch of people. And our hydrology team did some very large-scale studies looking at soil infiltration under different land uses across the whole of the CAS. And, you know, travelling around this area is hard enough. Doing it with the equipment hydrologists use is even harder. But they also did some really intensive plot scale work looking at evapotranspiration, interception, overland flow under different land uses at the plot scale. And what did they find? Well, they found that overland flow is much greater on the more degraded land. So from the rain that falls on the forest, about 2% flows overland, or reforested tree fallow, interestingly, had a similar percentage. But if the land was degraded, so this is post-Swidden agriculture, abandoned land, much higher proportion flows over land. And that really matters, of course, because if it's flowing over land, it's not infiltrating into the soil and therefore allowing recharge, dry season stream flows. You're also getting sedimentation, contamination of drinking water, and erosion. So how does this multiply up to an effect in terms of actual influence on people of effective conservation relative to the business as usual? So in terms of the absolute volume of water available, unfortunately our modelling of the seasonality isn't quite finished in time for this talk, but in terms of absolute availability of water, there's not a lot of influence. But in terms of people affected by changes in water quality, and this is measured by the human footprint on water quality, which is a good proxy for diarrheal disease, this has been demonstrated in a recent really nice study, we found that about 12,000 fewer people would have poor quality water under business as usual, under forest conservation relative to business as usual. So that's quite good news. But the problem is very few of these, probably less than 3,000, are actually close to the forest frontier and are those people that are feeling the opportunity costs that we've talked about. Okay, what about benefits from micro-development projects, the magnitude and distribution of those benefits? So in this area of CAS over the last 6 years, since the RED Plus project's been set up, there's been about 430 small-scale micro-development projects, and they're the whole range of sort of alternative livelihood type projects, beekeeping, staple crop production. And a team associated with part of our project team went to 61 of these micro-projects and interviewed just those people that had participated, that had benefited from these schemes. And what did they find? Well, some, and especially those targeted at staple crop production, seem to generate some important local benefits. If we look at food security, about 75% of people that had staple crop production projects said they were either very important or somewhat important. So that's good news. But if we look at beekeeping, we couldn't find a single person in those 61 projects that had benefited at all in food security or income generation from beekeeping. And many of these projects have really struggled to improve income or food security. And the real bad side is those are just the people who received those projects. There's huge biases in who benefits from these kind of livelihood projects. Another analysis of ours, just in one specific sub-area of the CAS, has shown that the people reached by micro-development projects tend to be those people that are more accessible. So rather than the more remote, close to the forest edge people that bear the biggest opportunity cost, the people that receive these development projects tend to be easier to access and are further from the forest. They're closer to roads. They've got the people that benefit have the higher food security, and they tend to be socially connected, politically and socially connected, members of forest management committees, local government, that kind of thing. So in conclusion, conservation absolutely has global benefits. We all know about that. But it does have very real costs, and we can't ignore those. These are costs being borne by some of the poorest people on the planet. We talk about local ecosystem service benefits, and of course they're very real and they're very hard to quantify, and I in no way want to suggest that this study has somehow just shown that local ecosystem services don't offset opportunity cost. We absolutely can't say that. For a start, we haven't monetized one and we have the other. But I just want to raise the point that they don't necessarily offset these benefits, and we need to be careful by flippantly saying, oh yes, of course, but conservation is good for local people because of these ecosystem service benefits. Micro-development projects that are funded through these large-scale payment schemes, may well help to offset costs, but they really need to work a lot better, and they need to reach a lot more of the affected people, and that's going to be extremely costly and extremely hard to do. So thank you very much for listening, and the papers are here.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of minutes for questions. If there are some. Yes, please.
Julia, thanks. Wonderful talk. I was wondering, do you think the solution is to have more roads?
Yes, and more mobile phone masts. Yeah. Yes, no, I mean, that was a flip answer. Absolutely. Poverty alleviation is not going to be solved for these people while they are so remote. So I can't remember if it was you or Dan was talking a lot about forest livelihoods and the fact that we tend to ignore them now because this kind of modern idea is they're kind of irrelevant to what's going to change the economies of these countries. I think that is kind of true, but the flip side is that's not changing fast. So these people are there, there's an awful lot of them, and they really are poor. So in the meantime, they really shouldn't be ignored, and they shouldn't be bearing the cost of global forest conservation, global ecosystem services, schemes, etc. So I think, yes, absolutely, these people are going to stay poor until Madagascar develops, and there's more roads, and there's more internet, and phone masts, etc. But in the meantime, they can't be ignored.
One quick question here.
Thanks, Julie. That was fascinating. Who's listening to this work in Madagascar? What purchases does it have amongst policymakers?
So the work that we've done showing that, so the work incorporating the hydro stuff is very, very new. I just presented it for the first time a couple of weeks ago, and the modelling's still underway. The final slide I presented about the biases in who's reached, in fact, that's actually specifically looking at compensation under World Bank funding. It's the PAPs, Project Affected Persons, and the biases in those. That we've presented a lot. We presented it a number of times to the World Bank at different scales during the project and to project implementers in Madagascar. It got a lot of coverage in the BBC when the paper came out, and actually I heard from the grapevine that the World Bank had actually considered writing a formal response to it and actually decided not to. It's not a criticism, but our point has always been we really don't want this project to draw attention on CAS and make CAS be seen as some terrible, it's failed to deliver. It's not about that. The individuals working in this project are really professional, really care, and they want to do their best. But there's a kind of reality gap, and what we've found good about this, the more we've talked about this, I've now heard other people from that project talk publicly where they're absolutely acknowledging these problems. They weren't doing that a year and a half ago. So I think that's where it's valuable. And other NGOs working in Madagascar have said, we've got exactly the same problem in our PAPs. Our PAP identification, we have to hire consultants. The maps aren't good enough. We don't know where the villages are. We haven't got enough money to send them to actually go to all the villages. So those problems are absolutely everywhere. And the last thing I would want to do is draw attention. I think a case study approach is very valuable because it's concrete and it draws people in. But there's a risk in it that people kind of go, right, Kaz has done it badly, and it's a kind of simple meme. And that's not true at all. It's an inherent problem in this system where there's just a lot of problems, and it's not that this is a particularly bad project. It's not at all.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Julie. So the next speaker is Bascavira, talking about the political ecology of ecosystem services.
Thank you very much. For those of you who've been here all through the session, actually, it's been really good to have all my colleagues setting up what I'm going to say really well. So I'm going to take you to some of the field locations where we've been working largely in North India and Nepal, but also discuss some of the theoretical ideas that political ecology has been trying to promote. And it's kind of opportune in terms of timing, given that we're celebrating 150 years of the term ecology, that we can now start to add the additional term political into our thinking about ecology. And Mike's introduction this morning, welcoming all of us to Liverpool, I think really set up this idea of how ecology has evolved over this period. And it started to take things that the social scientists have been talking about for a long time into account. And it's also very striking that Simon's talk told us that once you include people in your model, it starts to become much more accurate. So there's a sort of convergence of ideas here, which is really useful, I think. I considered doing a sort of long theoretical introduction to political ecology, and then decided I'd make it more simple in terms of focusing on why political ecology might actually matter when we're thinking about ecosystem services. And Julia's talk has just told us exactly why, which is that when you're trying to intervene, there are winners and losers. And those costs and benefits are often hidden, are often distributed differently in terms of who the beneficiaries are and who the gainers are. And things like proximity to roads and various other places influence those who become beneficiaries as opposed to those who remain hidden losers. So there's a whole set of questions that we need to ask around who is gaining and who is losing when we're intervening in a well-meaning way. And I think your point is really important, that we're not just saying that these are badly managed projects. These are actually well-meaning projects that are intending to do good, but there are unexpected or intended hidden losers, and we need to be conscious about that. And that's the kind of question that political ecology is actually asking you to think about. And then to try and look for deeper structural causes of that. What is the nature of power in that landscape? How is it distributed? Who makes the decisions? How do those decisions get implemented? Those are the sorts of questions that you're also trying to look at, rather than just saying this is an unfortunate outcome of the distribution of benefits. So those are the sort of issues that political ecology has been concerned with ever since it started to be used as a sort of field of knowledge. The other issue I wanted to talk about was about the politics of knowledge itself. I think it's really important to recognize that the fact that we live in a world where knowledge is contested doesn't mean that we inhabit this post-truth world that we've all been worried about over the last 6 to 8 months. The fact that knowledge can be contested legitimately through different sources of authority is actually quite important to take on board, without suggesting that somehow we are in this fake news world which is inhabited by my Facebook feed. Contestation of knowledge is actually quite a legitimate process to take forward. And there are, I mean, even Simon's multiple models, which are telling us different stories about the landscape, are important ways in which knowledge is contested. The assumptions that feed into those models, the data that drives those models, is actually a legitimate form of argumentation between those models. So the idea that there's one sole objective truth out there, and that everything else is somehow undermining that truth, is something we need to think really carefully about. And that's kind of what this post-truth discourse has been saying, that there is a truth and everybody else is distorting that truth. But actually this is what political ecology tells us, is that there are legitimate reasons why people hold particular beliefs and values, and those values can come into contest with each other. And that politics is really important. So what is nature? Whose nature? Who decides what type of nature should be conserved? What knowledge is used, and whose interests are served by those choices? Those are the sort of really important questions that political ecology is concerned with. So a political ecology approach to ecosystem services would probably do the 3 things that are on that slide. You still need to do all the fantastic work that Julia's team's been doing in Madagascar. You really get dirty measuring what's going on there. You need to start to put values where those discursive framings are important to engage with people who've been ignoring the important values that emerge. But we also need to recognize that this is a contested space in which you're negotiating all the time over the politics of who benefits and who loses from these ecosystem services. So a political ecology approach will recognize that these are the stages that you might undertake, but also recognize that you have contestation all the time in each of those processes, and being conscious of that. So taking you to some of the work that we've been doing through ESPA-funded work in India and Nepal, we were looking at the politics of water in the Himalayas, looking particularly at how small towns, which are burgeoning throughout the Himalayan ecosystem, get water from the surrounding landscape. Now, 2 design principles helped us to bring the focus into ecosystem services very explicitly. These are towns which are typically anywhere from 3,000 to 6,000 feet above sea level. So it's easier to let gravity do the job of transporting water down to them than to pump water up from the valley floor. So inherently, it's better to think about an ecosystem-based solution rather than to think about hard engineering schemes. So there was kind of a design principle which helped us to recognize this dependence. And the other is, of course, because these are sort of small mountain towns, they've been pretty neglected by large infrastructure investment. So again, they're reliant on local solutions for their water needs. So you're starting to get the importance of protecting nature for water supply as an obvious solution to some of these issues. I don't have time to tell you about the details of our findings, but that's obviously one interesting context in which we started to unpick the upstream-downstream contestation that takes place. There are villages upstream that are now deciding to grow vegetables for market. That same water is needed for their aspirations in terms of their market transformations, and you start to get upstream-downstream contests between people in the same landscape, and you need to understand how those are negotiated between people. And they're not always negotiated through a payment mechanism. There are all sorts of informal mechanisms of transactions that actually inform some of those arrangements. So trying to understand that is part of what we've been doing. I happened to go to Salt Lake City for a conference a couple of years ago. And one of these lovely conference field trips took me up into this watershed, the Wasatch Watershed. It's where Salt Lake City held the Winter Olympics, for those of you who are familiar with it. It's also the watershed that supplies Salt Lake City, about 2 million people, with its water. And this was one of these classic conference field trips, half a day up into the mountains. And I was just fascinated by the story. So a student of mine and I dug a bit deeper into it. It goes way before the very well-celebrated New York watershed story that we've all heard about, which is the classic payment for ecosystem services story. This was established by Roosevelt back in 1906. It's a protected watershed, and it's managed in order to ensure that Salt Lake City gets its water. But there isn't any payment from the utility downstream back to the forest managers, or indeed to any of the ski resorts which continue to have high-value skiing taking place at the same time. Instead, what they've got is something called a multi-stakeholder mountain accord. You've got a multi-stakeholder agreement. People agree on restrictions on land use. You're not allowed to take your horses up into the landscape. You're not allowed to take dogs into the landscape because water quality matters. And the ski resorts actually control numbers because they recognize that it is important to maintain the watershed. The US Forest Service ranger we spoke to said, my primary function is delivering water. I've not heard a single forester in the Indian landscape say that my primary function is delivering water. So it's just fascinating to hear that. We wrote that up as kind of an example because this is where the sort of knowledge production really starts to matter. From the literature, the New York example has been so widely cited as though payments for protections of these watersheds is probably the best or the only way we can go. And actually, this story has been quite neglected, and we looked at a lot of the kind of literature to try and see whether anyone's written this up. So that kind of helps us to think about the ways in which these knowledge production systems reinforce particular narratives, almost reinforcing certain solutions without necessarily looking at the entire range of possibilities. So just very quickly to summarize, what the research shows is that ecosystem services are indeed valued very differently by different stakeholders, that knowledge about these is contested. We need to be aware of this contestation. A lot of the work that we've been doing shows that the moment you intervene in these landscapes, you generate new political dynamics without thinking about the governance issues that Dan was talking about in his talk. When you introduce a community forest management institution, you disrupt local political dynamics. Somebody becomes more powerful than somebody else, and even if they don't lose monetarily, there is an internal power dynamic which you need to understand and negotiate. So actually trying to understand that is important. So the winners and losers are not just the monetary winners and losers that Julia's work has highlighted, but also people who perceive a loss of power or prestige. So there's a lot going on in that political landscape. Very quickly, I just want you to kind of quickly recognize that political ecology has often been seen as a discipline of critique. It exposes a lot of the things that we've been talking about here, the undesirable aspects of decision-making and the impacts on people. But actually, there's a more positive story that political ecology can also be used to construct positive narratives from the field, detailed analyses showing how knowledge, understanding, and decision-making actually supports particular groups of people in their aspirations as well. So we don't only have to see it as a discipline of critique, but it can also be a discipline that informs a new form of ecology. And this is why it matters. This kind of catches up with some of the things that, again, Julia and others have been talking about. You have winners and losers. Those costs and benefits are often hidden, and you have to start to ask these questions. If global ecosystem service schemes are having large local costs, we're having to make really big decisions about choice between and across nations, who gets to define these questions, including between the present and the future. So what we're moving towards, I hope, is a political and socially engaged approach to ecosystem services, recognizing this political ecology and not just trying to optimize by intervening in the landscape. That's kind of the big take-home message.
Thank you, Bhaskar. We have time for one quick question if anybody has one. Yes, one up here.
I just realized we're all very blinded by the light here.
Metaphorically.
I found the thing you said about the Salt Lake City Accord really interesting. It seems quite a strong alternative to the payment for ecosystem services model. What social and political conditions do you think need to be in place for that sort of accord to exist? I mean, do you think it could also work in developing countries, or do you think it's a one-off example?
So I don't think it's a one-off example. I can tell you the particular history. So it was set up under Roosevelt's administration in the early 20th century when a lot of public lands were acquired for public purpose. And indeed, that continues to be one of the kind of large areas of contestation within the US politically, where you probably heard about the kind of occupation of the reserve in Oregon last year. This question about does the federal government have the right to acquire lands for public purpose is really important. Roosevelt, of course, did a lot of that. So there was a regulatory taking, as it were, which underpinned that to start with. But the pressures on that landscape have increased, including this kind of very high-value tourism. And it seems that the dialogue between the different stakeholders, which has been conducted, as far as I can tell, in a sort of pretty open way, does seem to have helped, underpinned by the fact that this was already recognized as a landscape that needed to be protected. So there wasn't the kind of large-scale urbanization or developmental pressure that you might experience in some parts of the developing world. Now, again, the landscapes that we were working with in India and Nepal are also actually quite remote. And although they're experiencing some of these pressures, there is an opportunity to say, can we intervene here without necessarily assuming that payments is the right way to go? People tried a PES in one of our landscapes, and it hasn't really worked. So, there are other stakeholder forums, and these community forestry groups that Dan has been talking about in his talk. This idea that you can actually have a negotiated settlement at a local scale, which doesn't necessarily involve a financial transaction. I think it's really important to get that message out, because otherwise the knowledge production says, okay, if you've got an ecosystem service problem, solve it with a PES. And I think that's not always going to be true.
Okay, thank you very much, Bhaskar. So the final talk is E.J. Milner-Gulland and a three-dimensional concept of human well-being.
I'm going to start by apologising for that title and reassuring you that that is not the actual title. There won't be much conceptual stuff. It's very much on the applying side rather than the conceptual side. So I thought I'd give you some information from a new project that we're just finishing up now that's basically Emily Beauchamp's PhD, supervised by me and Tom Clements, tracking 7 years of wellbeing change in northern Cambodia, using that concept, but only introducing it very briefly. So changing wellbeing is something that we're using quite widely now in conservation as a framework for social impact evaluation. And as we all know, that means more than just money. It means having a good life. And our team, of which I'm one of many, have adapted the kind of approach that was developed in the Wellbeing in Developing Countries framework, adding in some elements from the World Bank Voices of the Poor study to get some kind of, here's the three-dimensional bit, concept of social well-being, which involves first understanding what people have, so their material well-being, then thinks about what they can do with what they have, which is the relational side, and these combine to shape how people feel about what they have and what they can do with what they have. So there's our three-dimensional concept. Moving swiftly on. I am now going to use elements from that three-dimensional approach to think about something that concerns me quite a lot in terms of the way that we think about well-being in conservation and the way we do conservation and evaluate the impacts that conservation is having on people, which is about dynamics. A lot of what we do when we're thinking about the impact of conservation is to take a baseline, is to ask people how they think they will feel under a conservation intervention. Of course, what happens then is we hopefully, under best practice, implement our conservation intervention. There'll be a rocky period in transition as the intervention beds in. Then hopefully we have an intervention that continues over time in the context of changing social ecological systems and changing external drivers that are also affecting people's well-being, often much more severely than the conservation intervention. We also have to realise that as society changes, as people grow up, generations change, social context changes, aspirations change as well. And so what we thought when we started about the impact that conservation might be having on that system may no longer be true fairly swiftly. And I think we should bear that more in mind when we're thinking about how conservation affects a system. We're actors within that system. So what we need, I think, now is assessments of what the true impact of conservation is over the longer term and the changing impact of conservation in that changing system. Okay, and I'm going to try and provide just a short snapshot of the project that we're doing that's trying to address that need. And it's in the northern plains of Cambodia, where there's 2 protected areas, which you can see in pink there. So this is a landscape in which people coexist with very high levels of biodiversity. There's a large number of people in this landscape, many forest villages, a lot of indigenous groups, but also Khmer people as well, of whom about 10,000 are inside protected areas, using a range of natural resource-dependent livelihoods. And I'll just focus you on liquid resin there, because it's a very important cash generator in that economy, and particularly in the past has generated quite a substantial proportion of household income. So the Wildlife Conservation Society came in 2005 and implemented a couple of conservation interventions. First of all, they supported the Cambodian government in declaring and then managing protected areas, the 2 pink areas I just showed you. They also implemented from 2007 onwards in 4 of the 16 villages 3 different payment programs: a payment for bird nest protection, which is an individual payment to individuals who find and protect bird nests, a payment as an agricultural premium for rice that is grown by farmers who abide by rules, basically, and a community-based ecotourism thing based around birds. And Tom Clements, for his PhD, used a range of different relatively quantitative measures to assess the effect of these conservation interventions on human well-being. And I'm mostly going to focus on household poverty measured by Basic Necessities Survey. And I'm particularly going to focus on the panel data set he had, which measured change in household well-being, using these measures, in a set of households within the protected area, some of which also were part of the payment schemes, and then some people in a match control village. So it's a before-after control intervention match study. So I'm not going to go into great detail of his results because I'm going to move on to the next bit. Briefly speaking, one of the core results of that 3-year study was that, as far as we could see, protected areas on aggregate didn't either exacerbate or alleviate poverty. This is an area in which is recovering from nasty civil war, and the whole area, well-being and wealth as well, are generally increasing. But the people within the protected areas seem to be increasing at about the same rate as the people in the control villages. In terms of the payment scheme, so this is the payment schemes within the protected area. Basically, the biodiversity payments, the individual payments for birds nest protection, had no effect on household wealth increase, whereas the 2 more complex ones, the payments for ibis rice to farmers and the ecotourism project, were increasing wealth faster than matched households of similar baseline wealth. So they were having some impact, which is good because, money was being put into these things and it was actually having an effect. Okay. So what happened next? What happened next in Cambodia was a massive increase in economic land concessions, which caused a great deal of concern overseas and also in Cambodia. And these were ostensibly there for agricultural development, but a lot of them were put in place in order to allow people to remove the valuable natural resources, mostly timber, off land, which then may or may not have been put into productive agriculture. So that was a big thing. The moratorium was declared in 2012. If you look at our control villages, which are the ones in red, so the match controls, and the protected area villages, which are the ones that are kind of outlined in green, what you can see is that protected areas did at least protect against being turned into land concessions, mostly. And that's true across Cambodia. The control villages, many of them ended up in that period under rubber plantations as part of the economic land concession. So our question then is, what happened next to our control villages and to our protected area villages? So we came in with Emile Beauchamp's PhD. There she is in the pink shirt, interviewing a schoolmaster in Prévert province. So we're trying there to get a more nuanced assessment of wellbeing change, and not just based on basic necessities, service and agricultural productivity, but also subjective and relational things. And then thinking about how the different development pathways in the villages have affected their well-being. So I think this is one of the core results. This is 3 villages that we looked at. One was a core PES village within the protected area that had had the benefit of all of WCS's work. The second one was on the edge of a protected area. It was a village where an ELC came in. WCS supported the village institutions to fight back against that ELC, and much of the land that was going to go under ELC was returned to the villages. So there was a kind of contestation, which the villages won in the end. And Village C has been completely enveloped in a ELC. It was a control village. It was never within the protected area. Now it's under rubber. So this is people's assessments of, over the 3 years, the change in wellbeing components that they have experienced. So you can see in Village A, most of it is around access to natural resources has improved a lot. Access to agricultural land has improved quite a lot. In the contested village, it's a bit more ubiquitous. You can see natural resources reduced, but there is a positivity about external development support, which is about WCS being involved, I think. The ELC village, what's been important for them in the positive sense is solidarity and equality and ethics within the village, and a big loss of access to natural resources and agricultural land. So these squares tell a story. What tells a better story is what people say. So here's how people have said it. And the first one I've put in bold because that is the sentiment that is shared across the landscape, that land is what's important, access to agricultural land. Here's someone in the PES village, just thinking about some of the negative things that are starting to happen, a bit of commoditization of some of the relationships within the village that are there now that it's becoming wealthier, interestingly. Okay, here's Village C. This is the one with the ELCs. So some negativity around loss of land, difficulty with paying back debts, but also some thought about solidarity. We've had to pull together because of this awful thing that's happened to us. Okay, so those are about village relational well-being. The next set of quotes on the other side are going to be around ecosystem services. So Village B here, interestingly, I've lost my resin trees, which I said was the source of income, but life is better. I grow cassava and I get more money than I used to get because I sell my cassava to traders. Here's a nice quote for a conservationist. Really good expression of ecosystem service values coming out there amongst that quote there. So forest is my friend, it keeps rainwater in the soil, it gives me wildlife, it gives me leaves, it gives me tourists. And here's another one around logging, so saying, well, we might as well take our ecosystem service, we might as well take our timber because somebody else is going to if we don't. Okay, so that's interesting kind of in-depth stuff that she was doing. We did do a broad thing about across the landscape. This is 20 villages in the control and in the protected areas. No time to tell you about any stats. Here's some headline results. So first of all, in 2008, when we started with our baseline, we thought there'd be 2 pathways out of poverty, mechanisation and livelihood diversification. As conservationists, we felt we could support the diversification. In fact, that's what the PES was involved in. In 2011, our interim thing, we found mechanisation underway across the landscape, and these mini tractors are the fundamental driving force of mechanisation. In 2014, more access, more homogenisation, more mechanisation, although the richest households were able to be diversifying as well. What about the effects of conservation? So in 2011, already the PA villages, the protected area villages, had more reliance on resin trees than the control villages, mostly because they still had them. And in 2014, that is still the case. In 2008 to 11, the protected areas had no effect on change in wealth overall. I showed you that. I'm not going to show you the stats, but in 2011 to 14, we were starting to see some limitation on that, some potential view that PAs are starting to constrain people's development. The big success story is ibis rice. So that's the agri payments for farmers who are abiding by rules. They were continuing to outperform other households within the protected areas. The ecotourism and the bird's nest, not so much. So they were ibis rice was the thing that was taking off. And interestingly, that was happening much faster in the second part of the period than in the first. And it feels like ibis rice is starting to take some time. It needed some time to embed complex new institutions, complex new trading arrangements. So it needed time for that benefit to start to transpire. So what next? So in the broad sense, I think we need lots of long-term, more nuanced evaluations of the interactions between conservation and development in dynamic socioeconomic systems. And I guess our hopeful question when we're thinking about Caroline's win-wins is, can conservation landscapes support sustainable diversification once things start to get a bit tighter? Once natural resources become more valuable, can we use those conservation landscapes to support sustainable diversification? In terms of where we are with our case study, it's clear the match design cannot continue. We've still got a panel, we're still looking at the panel, but the controls are not controls anymore. However, we've just got some funding from a source called 3IE to continue, and that will be thinking about that panel, expanding the panel, but not using them in terms of a backy design match control anymore. And I think we've really got some quite nice evidence that ibis rice is really starting to take off, and in fact there's more money from the Darwin Initiative to roll it out. The thing that needs to be done is it needs to be rolled out to poorer households. So in the next round, we're starting to think about how do you support mechanisation, how do you support diversification for those households. Thank you.
We have time for one quick question, if anyone has one.
No, they want their lunch.
Everybody wants their lunch.
I think they want their lunch.
So that's one.
Yeah, shout.
Can you explain why the controls aren't controls anymore?
I think the controls aren't controls anymore because I think they're on a completely different development pathway now. So I guess when you're thinking about controls, the point about a control is that it needs, it needs to. So in 2008 we were careful to pick households that were in the same remote forested areas that were using similar kinds of livelihoods. We're thinking about how those, but I think, when you get pathways that completely diverge, of course you can continue to use them as controls, but when you're trying to answer questions about how is conservation affecting livelihoods as against a kind of control where the conservation isn't in place, when you start to have completely different development pathways which can't be reconciled, I don't think they're not commensurate anymore.
Okay, I think we need to finish it there. The speakers are all at the front, so if anyone has additional questions, do come and grab them before you go. But let's thank Caroline for organising this session, ESPA and the BES for funding it, and all the speakers for a really great set of interesting talks with new findings in this area. So thanks, everyone.